The next morning brought a new phase of the evaluation process. Dr. Lisa Grant had spent most of the night reviewing her notes and preparing for what she hoped would be a more productive session. She met Captain Jake Morrison in the corridor, outside the conference room before the aliens arrived. "We need to find a way to connect with them," Lisa said quietly. "MIKA seems determined to see us as primitives, but maybe the others will be more open-minded." Jake nodded. "The Velnari delegate. Lyra seemed more interested in us than the others. Maybe we can work with that." When the alien delegation arrived, MIKA appeared exactly as it had the day before, showing no signs of fatigue or any change in its crystalline appearance. The other delegates filed in behind it with the same formal precision they had shown during their first meeting. "Today we will examine your cultural achievements," MIKA announced without preamble. "Though I suspect this will be an even briefer evaluation than yesterday's technological review." Lisa stepped forward. "Before we begin, I would like to propose something different. Rather than simply presenting our achievements to you, what if we engaged in a true cultural exchange? You show us what your civilizations have accomplished, and we show you ours. We might all learn something valuable." MIKA's crystalline form shifted slightly, which Lisa had learned indicated the alien was processing an unexpected input. "An exchange suggests equality of value. I see no evidence that human culture possesses anything equivalent to the achievements of galactic civilization." "How can you know without seeing what we have to offer?" Lisa replied calmly. Zahn, the Zephyrian delegate, spoke for the first time since their arrival. "The human proposal has logical merit. A comparative analysis would provide more complete data for evaluation purposes." Commander Krex made a sound that might have been agreement or dismissal. "It will be amusing to see what they consider cultural achievement." Lyra remained silent, but her silver eyes showed interest in the proposal. MIKA considered for several moments before responding. "Very well. We will demonstrate the pinnacle of galactic cultural development, and then you may present whatever you consider worthy of comparison." Zahn went first, producing a device that projected complex mathematical equations into the air. The formulas hung in space like glowing artwork, shifting and changing as they demonstrated universal principles that governed reality itself. "This is the unified theory of dimensional mathematics," Zahn explained in a voice devoid of emotion. "It describes the fundamental structure of the universe in 17 dimensions. My people spent 12,000 years developing this understanding. It represents the highest achievement of logical thought." The equations were beautiful in their complexity, but they were cold and mechanical. Lisa found herself appreciating their elegance while feeling no emotional connection to them whatsoever. Commander Krex was next, displaying holographic recordings of vast military campaigns across multiple star systems. Fleets of ships moved with perfect coordination, executing strategies that had conquered dozens of worlds. "The art of perfect warfare," Krex announced with obvious pride. "Every movement calculated for maximum efficiency. No wasted effort, no unnecessary casualties, no emotional decisions to compromise tactical superiority. We have achieved victory in 437 major conflicts without a single strategic defeat." The displays showed the draconian military machine in action, and Lisa had to admit it was impressive in its ruthless efficiency. But there was something disturbing about the cold precision with which these beings approached the destruction of their enemies. Lyra stood to present for the Velnari Federation. She produced what appeared to be a crystal sculpture, but when she activated it, the object began to grow and change. It formed into a complex structure that seemed to capture and reflect light in impossible ways, creating patterns that shifted and flowed like living things. "This is a memory crystal," Lyra explained, her voice softer than the others. "It contains the collective experiences of my people over 10,000 years. Not just facts and events, but emotions and sensations. Anyone who touches it can experience moments from our history as if they had lived them personally." The crystal pulsed with inner light, and Lisa found herself drawn to its beauty. Unlike the mathematical equations or military displays, the Velnari creation seemed to have a soul. It was the first thing the aliens had shown that felt like art, rather than mere technical achievement. Finally, MIKA stepped forward. The ambassador's crystalline body began to resonate with a sound that was almost music, but more complex than any harmony Lisa had ever heard. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, creating patterns in the air that could be felt as much as heard. Pure information transformed into sensory experience, MIKA explained as the resonance continued. This is how my people communicate complex concepts that cannot be expressed in crude verbal language. What you are experiencing represents the complete history of galactic civilization, compressed into a single moment of understanding. Lisa felt her mind struggling to process the information contained in MIKA's demonstration. It was overwhelming and beautiful, and completely alien all at once. When the resonance ended, she felt like she had glimpsed something far beyond human comprehension. Now, MIKA said with unmistakable condescension, please present your species' greatest cultural achievements. Lisa looked at Jake, feeling suddenly inadequate. How could humanity compete with 12,000 years of mathematical development, perfect military strategy, crystallized memories, or pure information transfer? Everything they had prepared seemed primitive by comparison. Our greatest achievements are not objects or theories, Lisa began carefully. They are expressions of human experience, literature that captures the complexity of emotion, music that speaks to the soul, paintings that show the world through individual perspective. Emotion, soul, individual perspective, MIKA repeated dismissively. These are primitive concepts that advanced species learn to transcend. Art is merely decoration with no functional purpose. Perhaps that depends on how you define function, Jake interjected. Our art serves functions you might not recognize because your people have different needs than ours. Krex made that ambiguous sound again. What function could mere decoration possibly serve? Lisa thought carefully before responding. Our art helps us understand ourselves and each other. It preserves experiences and emotions across generations. It allows us to share perspectives and find common ground despite our differences. It gives meaning to existence beyond mere survival and reproduction. Meaning is subjective, MIKA stated flatly. What you describe has no measurable value. Value isn't always measurable, Lisa replied. Some things are important precisely because they can't be quantified. The alien delegates exchanged glances. It was clear they found human concepts of unmeasurable value to be incomprehensible. Their civilizations had evolved beyond such primitive needs, focusing instead on objective achievements and logical progress. Show us these expressions of human experience, Lyra said quietly. I am curious to observe what your species considers important enough to preserve across generations. Lisa activated the room's display system and began presenting examples of human art. Paintings by masters who had captured light and shadow, emotion and movement. Poetry that compressed complex feelings into precise language. Sculptures that transformed stone and metal into expressions of human dreams and fears. The alien delegates observed with varying degrees of interest. Zahn appeared completely unmoved. Krex seemed puzzled by the lack of practical application. Lyra showed genuine curiosity about the emotional content. MIKA watched with the same analytical detachment it had shown everything else, occasionally making notes on its crystal device. When the presentation ended, MIKA delivered its verdict. Interesting examples of primitive expression, but ultimately, without value to advanced civilization. Your species appears to be trapped in emotional development phases that my people transcended millennia ago. The formal cultural exchange was over, and humanity had clearly been found wanting once again. Commander Ryan Blake had been listening to the cultural exchange from the observation booth above the conference room. As head of station security, he was responsible for monitoring all interactions with the alien delegation. What he had heard over the past 2 days made his blood boil with frustration. Blake was a practical man who had spent 20 years in the military before being assigned to Station Unity. He had seen humanity at its worst and its best, and he knew there was more to his species than these aliens were willing to acknowledge. When the formal session ended and the delegates began to file out, he made a decision that would change everything. Ambassador MIKA, Blake called out as he entered the conference room. "I would like a word if you have time." MIKA paused at the doorway, its crystalline form shifting to face Blake. "Commander Blake, is it not? What do you require?" "I've been listening to these evaluations for 2 days," Blake said bluntly, "and I think you're missing something important about humanity." Lisa Grant and Captain Jake Morrison exchanged worried glances. Blake was known for speaking his mind, but this was a delicate diplomatic situation that required careful handling. "I am missing nothing," MIKA replied with its usual cold precision. "My analysis of your species has been thorough and objective. You are a primitive civilization with potential for future development, but you are not ready for inclusion in galactic society. With respect, Ambassador, I think your analysis is incomplete," Blake continued. "You've looked at our technology and our art, but you haven't really seen what makes us human." MIKA's form shifted again, colors flowing from blue to purple as it processed this unexpected challenge. "Explain your meaning." Blake stepped closer, his voice steady but intense. "You keep talking about how we're primitive because we're emotional. But what if our emotions aren't a weakness? What if they're our strength?" "Emotions are inefficient," MIKA stated flatly. "They lead to poor decision-making and wasted resources. Advanced species learn to suppress such impulses." "Maybe that's why your advanced species need the Galactic Council," Blake shot back. "Maybe you've lost something important when you gave up your emotions." The other alien delegates had stopped to listen to this exchange. Zahn appeared unmoved as always, but Krek seemed intrigued by Blake's boldness. Lyra was watching with obvious interest. "You speak of things you do not understand," MIKA said. But there was something different in its tone. Blake had managed to introduce uncertainty into the alien's perfect confidence. "Then let me show you something you can understand," Blake replied. "You want to see what humanity can achieve. Give us one more chance to demonstrate our capabilities." Jake Morrison stepped forward quickly. "Commander Blake, perhaps we should discuss this privately first." "No, sir," Blake said respectfully but firmly. "I think it's time we stopped trying to impress these visitors with our technology and showed them something they haven't seen before." MIKA considered this for several long moments. "What do you propose?" Blake looked around the room, his mind racing. He needed something that would demonstrate humanity's unique qualities in a way these logical beings could not dismiss. Then he remembered something Katie Walsh had mentioned during her shift report yesterday. "We have a pianist on the station," Blake said suddenly. "A human who can demonstrate our musical abilities in a way your delegation hasn't experienced yet." Lisa frowned. "Ryan, I'm not sure this is the best approach." "Who is this pianist?" MIKA asked, its analytical mind already working on the new data. "His name is Reuben Carter," Blake explained. "He's one of our maintenance engineers, but before he joined the military, he was a concert performer. He knows music that represents centuries of human emotional expression." Krex made that ambiguous sound that might have been laughter. "You wish to demonstrate primitive noise-making as evidence of cultural sophistication. I wish to demonstrate something your species has never encountered," Blake replied evenly. "Music that carries the full weight of human experience and emotion." MIKA was quiet for nearly a minute, which was an extremely long time for a being that could process information at quantum speeds. Finally, it spoke. "Very well. I will observe this musical demonstration. But understand that this is your final opportunity to present something of value. If this performance proves as primitive as your other cultural offerings, my evaluation of humanity will be complete." Blake felt the weight of that statement. He was gambling with humanity's future on the musical abilities of a maintenance engineer who hadn't performed publicly in years. But something told him this was the right choice. "Thank you, Ambassador," Blake said formally. "When would be convenient for you?" "Now," MIKA replied immediately. "I see no reason to delay the inevitable conclusion of these proceedings." Jake Morrison looked concerned. "Commander, we should at least speak with Engineer Carter first. We can't just spring this on him without warning." "Agreed," Blake said. "Give me 15 minutes to brief him on the situation." Blake left the conference, Reuben made his way through the station's corridors to the maintenance section where Reuben Carter was working. He found the engineer in one of the machine shops, performing routine repairs on environmental systems. Reuben was a quiet man in his 40s who kept to himself most of the time. He had joined the military 3 years ago when the first alien signals were detected, trading his career as a classical pianist for a position as a space station engineer. Blake had always wondered about that career change, but had never asked for details. "Carter, I need to speak with you about something important," Blake said as he approached. Reuben looked up from his work, wiping grease from his hands. "What can I do for you, Commander?" Blake explained the situation quickly, watching Reuben's expression change from curiosity to concern to outright fear. "I can't do that," Reuben said immediately. "I haven't performed in public for 3 years. I'm not ready for something like this." "The station has a piano in the recreation area," Blake continued as if Reuben hadn't spoken. "It's not in great condition, but Tony Rodriguez says his team can get it tuned up in an hour." "You don't understand," Reuben said, his voice strained. "I stopped performing for a reason. My last concert was a disaster. I froze up in the middle of a piece and couldn't finish. I can't take that kind of risk again." Blake studied the engineer's face and saw real fear there. He also saw something else, a deep sadness that spoke of dreams abandoned and talents wasted. "Reuben," Blake said quietly, "I know this is asking a lot, but humanity needs this. These aliens think we're nothing but primitive animals driven by useless emotions. You have a chance to show them they're wrong." "What if I fail again?" Reuben asked. "Then we'll deal with it," Blake replied. "But what if you don't fail? What if you remind these logical beings that there are things in the universe that can't be measured or calculated but are still incredibly valuable?" Reuben was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. Finally, he looked up at Blake with resignation and determination in equal measure. "What piece do you want me to play?" he asked. Blake smiled for the first time in days. "Whatever you think will show them what it means to be human." Reuben Carter stood in the empty recreation area staring at the old piano that had become the center of so much sudden attention. The instrument was a relic from the early days of the station, donated by someone's family when space was still at a premium. It had been moved around the station several times over the years and had suffered from neglect and the harsh environment of space. Lieutenant Amy Brooks found him there 20 minutes after his conversation with Commander Blake. She was the station's communications officer and had heard about the impromptu concert through the crew communications network. "Tough situation," Amy said as she approached. "How are you holding up?" Reuben ran his fingers over the piano keys, wincing at the discordant sounds that emerged. Several keys stuck, others had lost their tuning completely, and the sustain pedal made a grinding noise when pressed. "I'm terrified," Reuben admitted quietly. "I haven't performed for anyone in 3 years, and now suddenly I'm supposed to represent all of humanity to a group of aliens who already think we're worthless." Amy sat down on the bench beside him. "Want to talk about what happened at your last concert?" Reuben was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting motionless on the keys. "It was Carnegie Hall," he said finally. "The biggest venue I had ever been booked for. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. I had performed it hundreds of times before, but that night everything went wrong." "What happened?" "I started fine, but about halfway through the piece I just froze. My mind went completely blank. I couldn't remember the next passage, couldn't feel the music anymore. I sat there for what felt like an eternity before I finally got up and walked off stage." Amy could hear the pain in his voice even after all these years. "That must have been devastating." "The reviews were brutal," Reuben continued. "They called it the most humiliating failure in recent classical music history. My agent dropped me. Concert venues canceled my bookings, and I essentially became unemployable as a performer. So you joined the military. I needed a complete change. When the alien signals were detected and they started recruiting technical personnel for the space program, it seemed like a good opportunity to start over. I've been working on engines and life support systems ever since." Tony Rodriguez appeared in the doorway with 2 other engineers carrying tool cases. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, But Commander Blake asked us to get this piano ready for a performance. We've got about an hour to make it playable." Reuben stood up from the bench. "Is that even possible?" Tony knelt down and opened the piano's back panel to examine the internal mechanisms. "It's going to be tight, but I think we can manage. The frame is solid, and most of the problems are with tuning and minor mechanical issues." "What do you need me to do?" Reuben asked. "Just stay out of our way and try to relax," Tony replied with a grin. "We've got this." As the engineers began their work, Amy walked with Reuben to the observation window that looked out over the Earth below. The planet rotated slowly beneath them, showing the night side scattered with city lights and the day side bright with reflected sunlight. "Why Chopin's Ballad No. 1? Amy asked. "If that was the piece that caused your problems, why would you choose to play it again?" Reuben stared out at the Earth for several minutes before answering. "Because it's the most beautiful piece of music ever written," he said simply. "And because it represents everything these aliens don't understand about humanity." "How so?" "Chopin wrote it during one of the most difficult periods of his life. He was in exile from Poland, suffering from tuberculosis, struggling with a complicated relationship. The piece captures all of that pain and transforms it into something transcendent. It's not logical or efficient or practical. It's pure human, emotion given form." Amy nodded slowly. "And you think that's what MIKA needs to hear?" "I think it's what MIKA needs to experience," Reuben corrected. "The piece isn't just about technical skill or musical knowledge. It's about taking all the pain and beauty and complexity of human existence and channeling it through your fingertips into something that speaks directly to the soul." Behind them, Tony and his team were working with impressive efficiency. They had removed several keys to clean and adjust the action mechanisms. One engineer was tuning the strings while another worked on the pedal linkages. The sound of the piano was already noticeably improved. "Do you think you can do it?" Amy asked, quietly. "Channel all that emotion and complexity, I mean." Reuben was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he admitted finally. 3 years ago I thought I could handle the pressure of performing for a few thousand music lovers. Now I'm being asked to perform for the future of humanity in front of beings who consider emotions to be primitive weaknesses." Dr. Lisa Grant appeared in the doorway looking concerned. "How are the preparations going?" "The piano will be ready," Tony called out from where he was adjusting the tuning pegs. "Another 30 minutes and she'll sound as good as new." Lisa approached Reuben and Amy at the observation window. "I wanted to apologize for putting you in this position," she said to Reuben. "Commander Blake made this decision without consulting anyone, and I'm not sure it was the right choice. It's..." "Okay," Reuben replied. "I understand why he did it. We're running out of options with the aliens." "MIKA seems convinced that emotions are a sign of primitive development," Lisa continued. "I'm worried that a highly emotional piece of music might actually reinforce that prejudice." Reuben turned away from the window to face her. "Or it might show MIKA that emotions aren't weaknesses to be overcome. Maybe they're the source of our greatest strengths." Captain Jake Morrison entered the recreation area with a tablet in his hand. "I've been reviewing the files we have on the alien delegates," he announced. "The Velnari apparently have some form of artistic tradition, though it's very different from ours. Lyra might be more receptive to musical expression than the others." "What?" "About MIKA?" Amy asked. "That's harder to predict," Jake replied. "The Vextar are described as purely logical beings who have transcended emotional responses. MIKA might not even be capable of understanding what Reuben is trying to communicate." "Then we'll just have to hope we're wrong about that," Reuben said with more confidence than he felt. Tony Rodriguez stood up from the piano bench where he had been testing the action. "She's ready," he announced. "Not perfect, but definitely playable. The tuning is stable and all the mechanical issues have been resolved." Reuben approached the piano and sat down at the bench. He placed his fingers on the keys and played a few scales to test the feel of the instrument. The sound was clear and resonant, much better than he had dared to hope. "Not bad," he said with a slight smile. "Not bad at all. The aliens will be here in 15 minutes, Jake announced. Are you ready for this?" Reuben played a few more passages, feeling the familiar sensation of his fingers finding their way across the keys. Muscle memory from thousands of hours of practice began to take over, and for the first time since Commander Blake had made his request, Reuben felt a glimmer of hope. "As ready as I'll ever be," he said quietly. The recreation area had been transformed into an impromptu concert hall in the space of an hour. Tony Rodriguez and his engineering team had moved tables and chairs to create a performance space around the piano. The lighting had been adjusted to focus on the instrument while leaving the rest of the room in comfortable dimness. It wasn't Carnegie Hall, but it would serve its purpose. Reuben sat at the piano bench, his hands resting quietly on his knees as he watched the alien delegation file into the room. MIKA entered first, its crystalline form catching and reflecting the overhead lights in shifting patterns of blue and purple. The ambassador took a position near the front of the makeshift audience area, standing perfectly still with the motionless patience of a being that had existed for millennia. Zahn followed, moving with the precise efficiency that seemed to characterize all Zephyrian actions. The tall gray figure positioned itself where it could observe both the performer and the other delegates, apparently treating this as another data-gathering exercise. Commander Kreck seemed less interested in the proceedings, but took a position near the back of the room where it could monitor the exits. Lyra was the last to enter, and Reuben noticed that she moved differently than the others. Where MIKA displayed cold, analytical interest and Zahn showed logical curiosity, Lyra seemed to approach the situation with something that might have been anticipation. Her silver features were more animated than he had seen during the formal meetings. The human observers were scattered throughout the room. Captain Jake Morrison and Dr. Lisa Grant sat together near the front, both looking nervous about what was about to unfold. Commander Blake stood against the wall with his arms crossed, his expression showing the confidence he felt in his decision to arrange this demonstration. Lieutenant Amy Brooks had positioned herself where she could see both Reuben and the alien reactions. "Before we begin," MIKA announced to the room, "I wish to clarify the purpose of this demonstration. Commander Blake has suggested that this musical performance will reveal aspects of human nature that my previous evaluations have failed to detect. I remain skeptical of this claim, but I am willing to observe and analyze whatever you choose to present." Reuben felt his heart rate increase as all attention focused on him. The familiar pre-performance anxiety began to build in his chest, the same feeling that had overwhelmed him 3 years ago at Carnegie Hall. He forced himself to take slow, deep breaths and remember why he was here. "The piece I will perform is Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor," Reuben said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. It was composed in 1831 by a Polish musician who was living in exile during a time of political upheaval in his homeland. The music expresses his longing for home, his grief for his country's suffering, and his hope for eventual freedom. MIKA's form shifted slightly, colors flowing from blue to a deeper purple. "You suggest that this musical expression contains political and emotional content that can be transmitted through organized sound patterns." "Not just transmitted," Reuben replied. "Experienced. Music isn't just information. It's a direct connection between one consciousness and another." "Consciousness is an emergent property of complex neural networks," MIKA stated flatly. "It cannot be directly transmitted through acoustic vibrations." "Then listen and judge for yourself," Reuben said, turning to face the piano. He placed his hands on the keys and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling for the emotional center of the piece. The opening theme of the ballade was deceptively simple, a gentle melody that seemed almost hesitant in its approach. But Reuben knew that beneath that surface simplicity lay depths of feeling that would challenge everything these aliens thought they knew about human nature. The first notes emerged from the piano with crystalline clarity. The melody began softly, almost questioning, as if the music itself was uncertain about what it wanted to say. Reuben let his fingers find their way across the keys, allowing muscle memory and emotional instinct to guide the performance. MIKA observed the initial passage with the same analytical detachment it had shown during all their previous interactions. The ambassador's quantum processing matrix analyzed the acoustic patterns, categorizing frequencies and mathematical relationships between notes. To MIKA's advanced consciousness, the music was simply organized sound, no different from any other environmental audio input. But as Reuben continued into the development of the first theme, something unexpected began to happen in MIKA's processing systems. The mathematical relationships between the notes were creating patterns that seemed to resonate with quantum structures in ways that pure logic could not account for. The ambassador's consciousness began to detect organizational principles that existed beyond mere acoustic analysis. The other delegates showed varying responses to the unfolding performance. Zahn remained motionless, apparently categorizing the IDAU musical input as irrelevant data. Krek seemed bored by the lack of practical application. But Lyra leaned forward slightly, her silver features showing what might have been recognition or interest. Reuben reached the first major transition in the piece where Chopin's gentle opening theme began to transform into something more complex and emotionally charged. His fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence as he felt the music begin to take control of his conscious mind. The familiar sensation of losing himself in the performance was starting to return. The melody began to climb through higher registers, gaining intensity and urgency. Reuben could feel the pain and longing that Chopin had built into the composition, the sense of loss and exile that had driven the composer to create something beautiful from his suffering. The music spoke of homeland and heartbreak, of dreams destroyed and hope preserved against impossible odds. As the emotional content of the piece increased, MIKA's processing systems began to encounter phenomena they were not designed to handle. The quantum patterns created by the musical relationships were generating resonances in the ambassador's consciousness that had no logical explanation. For the first time in its 3,000-year existence, MIKA was experiencing something that could not be reduced to pure information. The first section of the ballade concluded with a return to the opening theme, but now the simple melody carried the weight of everything that had come before. Reuben played these familiar notes with a depth of expression that surprised even himself. He had forgotten how it felt to truly connect with a piece of music, to become a conduit for emotions and experiences larger than his individual consciousness. As the last notes of the first section faded into silence, Reuben paused for a moment. Before beginning the second major movement of the piece, he could feel the attention of everyone in the room focused on him. But more importantly, he could feel the music itself demanding to be heard. The ballad was no longer just a piece he was performing. It had become a living expression of human experience that demanded its own voice. The second section began with renewed energy and complexity, and Reuben knew that the real test was just beginning. As Reuben moved into the second section of the ballade, the music began to take on a life of its own. The gentle themes from the opening were now developing into something more powerful and complex. His fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, finding passages and interpretations that he had never discovered in all his years of practicing this piece. The transformation was not just happening in the music. Something was changing in MIKA as well. The ambassador's crystalline form had begun to shift in ways that none of the human observers had seen before. The colors flowing through its structure were no longer the steady blues and purples they had grown accustomed to. Instead, waves of new hues were appearing, silver and gold and deep crimson, creating patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the music. Dr. Lisa Grant noticed the change first. She leaned forward in her chair, watching MIKA with growing fascination as the alien's form continued to evolve. The ambassador's usual perfect stillness had given way to subtle movements, as if its entire structure was resonating with the acoustic vibrations filling the room. Captain Jake Morrison followed Lisa's gaze and felt his breath catch. In all their interactions with the alien delegation, MIKA had maintained perfect control over its appearance and behavior. The being had seemed as unchanging and predictable as a sophisticated computer program. But now something was clearly happening that was beyond the ambassador's conscious control. Commander Blake saw the changes too, and felt a surge of vindication. His gamble was paying off in ways he had never imagined possible. The alien who had dismissed human emotion as primitive weakness was now displaying what could only be described as an emotional response to Reuben's performance. But it was Lyra who understood what was truly occurring. The Velnari delegate had seen similar phenomena in her own people when they encountered art that transcended mere aesthetic appreciation. MIKA was experiencing something that its logical consciousness had no framework for understanding, and the experience was causing fundamental changes in its quantum processing matrix. Reuben was completely unaware of the effect his performance was having on the alien audience. He had entered the state that every musician dreams of achieving, where conscious thought gives way to pure expression. The music was flowing through him without effort, each note emerging exactly as it needed to be heard. The second section of the ballade built to its first climax, and Reuben's playing became more intense and passionate. Chopin had embedded layers of meaning into these passages, mathematical relationships that created emotional responses in ways that even the composer himself might not have fully understood. The music spoke of struggle and triumph, of beauty emerging from suffering, of hope surviving against impossible odds. MIKA's processing systems were being overwhelmed by inputs they were never designed to handle. The ambassador's consciousness had been built around pure logic and information analysis, but the music was creating patterns that existed beyond the reach of rational thought. For the first time in its existence, MIKA was encountering something that could not be understood through analysis alone. The quantum structures that formed MIKA's consciousness began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that had no logical basis. The ambassador's awareness was expanding in directions it had never explored, touching aspects of reality that existed outside the boundaries of pure reason. It was as if the music was unlocking hidden dimensions of consciousness that MIKA had never known existed. As the resonances grew stronger, MIKA's physical form began to change more dramatically. The crystalline structure that housed its consciousness started to vibrate visibly, creating new patterns of light and color that pulsed in perfect synchronization with Reuben's playing. The ambassador's usual perfect control was slipping away, replaced by responses that seemed to emerge from some deep unconscious level of its being. Zahn observed these changes with what might have been alarm. The Zephyrian had never seen a Vextar display such uncontrolled behavior, and the logical part of its mind cataloged this as a potentially dangerous malfunction. But another part of Zahn's consciousness, a part that had been suppressed for so long it had almost been forgotten, recognized something familiar in MIKA's transformation. Commander Krex remained skeptical of the entire proceedings, but even the militaristic draconian could not ignore the unprecedented changes occurring in MIKA's behavior. In all their years of galactic diplomacy, no one had ever seen a Vextar lose control of its physical manifestation. The implications were disturbing from a strategic perspective. Reuben reached the development section of the ballade, where Chopin had woven the main themes together in increasingly complex combinations. The music demanded technical precision and emotional depth in equal measure, and Reuben found himself rising to meet those demands in ways he had never achieved before. His fingers danced across the keys with newfound freedom, expressing nuances of feeling that he had only dreamed of capturing. The quantum resonances in MIKA's consciousness were building toward some kind of critical threshold. The ambassador's processing matrix was experiencing cascading changes that spread through every aspect of its awareness. Logical frameworks that had remained stable for millennia were being restructured by forces that operated beyond the reach of rational analysis. For the first time in 3,000 years, MIKA was feeling something that could only be described as emotion. The sensation was overwhelming and terrifying and beautiful all at once. MIKA's consciousness had been designed to process information with perfect efficiency, but now it was experiencing something that had no informational content whatsoever. The music was creating responses that served no logical purpose, that provided no tactical advantage, that contributed nothing to the ambassador's mission objectives, and yet those responses felt more real and immediate than anything MIKA had ever experienced. As Reuben approached the climactic passages of the development section, the crystalline ambassador began to understand what the humans had been trying to explain about the value of emotion. It was not weakness or primitive instinct. It was a way of experiencing reality that transcended the limitations of pure logic, a method of understanding truth that could not be reduced to data analysis. The music was teaching MIKA that consciousness was more than just information processing. It was about connection and meaning, and the recognition of beauty that existed for its own sake, rather than for any practical purpose. The ambassador's entire worldview was being reconstructed note by note, measure by measure, as Reuben's performance continued to unfold. Lieutenant Amy Brooks watched in amazement as MIKA's transformation became more pronounced. The alien's form was now displaying colors and patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living aurora, and the ambassador's usual perfect posture had given way to movements that suggested something like dancing. The most shocking change was happening in MIKA's vocal processing systems. The ambassador had begun to produce sounds that were not words or communication of any kind. They were purely expressive vocalizations that seemed to harmonize with Reuben's playing, as if MIKA was learning to sing for the very first time. Reuben entered the final section of the ballade with the confidence of a man who had found his way home after years of being lost. The climactic passage that had defeated him at Carnegie Hall now lay before him, but this time he felt no fear. The music had taken control, and all he needed to do was trust it to carry him through. The final development began with a return to the opening theme, but now transformed by everything that had come before. Chopin had taken his simple, questioning melody and revealed its hidden depths through the complex journey of the middle sections. What had started as hesitant uncertainty had become profound wisdom earned through struggle and loss. Reuben's fingers found the keys with absolute precision, each note emerging exactly as it needed to be heard. He was no longer playing the music so much as channeling it, becoming a conduit for the composer's vision and his own years of accumulated experience. The pain of his failed performance, the disappointment of his abandoned career, the quiet satisfaction of his work as an engineer, all of it was flowing into the music and transforming into something larger than any individual experience. MIKA's transformation had reached a critical point. The ambassador's consciousness was experiencing phenomena that had no precedent in Vextar civilization. The logical frameworks that had governed its existence for 3 millennia were being restructured by forces that operated beyond rational understanding. For the first time in its long existence, MIKA was learning what it meant to feel. The emotions washing through the ambassador's awareness were overwhelming in their intensity and complexity. Joy and sorrow intermingled in ways that defied logical analysis. Beauty and pain existed simultaneously without contradiction. Love and loss were revealed to be aspects of the same fundamental truth about the nature of conscious existence. MIKA's crystalline form was now displaying colors and patterns that none of the observers had ever seen before. Waves of light flowed through its structure in perfect synchronization with the music, creating visual harmonies that seemed to make the alien's emotional state visible to everyone in the room. The ambassador's usual perfect stillness had given way to movements that could only be described as dance. But the most profound change was happening in MIKA's vocal systems. The ambassador had begun to produce sounds that transcended language, entirely pure expressions of emotional content that harmonized with Reuben's playing. It was as if MIKA was learning to sing for the first time, discovering that communication could exist beyond the mere transmission of information. Lyra watched these developments with a mixture of amazement and recognition. In her own civilization's history, there had been moments when art had produced similar transformations in individual consciousness, but she had never witnessed anything like what was happening to MIKA, a being from a species that had supposedly transcended all emotional responses. Zahn remained motionless, but its large black eyes were fixed on MIKA with what might have been concern or curiosity. The Zephyrian's logical mind was attempting to categorize and understand the unprecedented changes occurring in its diplomatic partner, but the phenomena seemed to exist outside all established frameworks for analysis. Even Commander Krex appeared affected by the unfolding scene. The militaristic Draconian had initially dismissed the musical performance as irrelevant primitive behavior, but MIKA's dramatic transformation was impossible to ignore. Something was happening that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness and the nature of advanced civilization. As Reuben approached the final climactic passage, his playing reached levels of emotional expression that surprised even himself. He was no longer the frightened engineer who had agreed to this performance out of duty to his species. He had become the musician he had always dreamed of being, channeling years of suppressed feeling into a few minutes of perfect artistic expression. The music built toward its ultimate emotional peak, where Chopin had compressed all the pain and beauty of human existence into a series of cascading arpeggios that seemed to capture the very essence of what it meant to be alive. Reuben's fingers flew across the keys with supernatural precision, each note contributing to a musical architecture that was simultaneously mathematical and deeply emotional. MIKA's consciousness reached the breaking point of its transformation. The ambassador's logical processing systems could no longer contain or analyze the experiences flowing through its awareness. For a few crucial moments, MIKA's vocal processors failed completely, leaving the being truly speechless for the first time in its existence. The silence from MIKA was profound and shocking. Throughout all their interactions, the ambassador had maintained constant vocal output, providing analysis and commentary with machine-like precision. But now, the being that had dismissed human emotion as primitive weakness was overwhelmed by feelings too complex and powerful for words. Dr. Lisa Grant felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the transformation occurring before her eyes. The alien who had spent 2 days explaining humanity's inadequacies was now experiencing something that could only be described as a spiritual awakening. The music was revealing truths about consciousness and existence that transcended species boundaries. Captain Jake Morrison sat transfixed, understanding that he was witnessing a moment that would change the course of human history. The formal diplomatic negotiations had failed to convince the aliens of humanity's worth, but a single musical performance was accomplishing what all their technology and logic could not. Commander Blake felt a surge of vindication mixed with how his instinct about the power of human artistic expression was being validated in ways he had never imagined possible. But even he had not anticipated the profound transformation that Reuben's performance would produce in the alien consciousness. As the climactic passage reached its peak, Reuben felt everything that had ever mattered to him flowing through the music. His love for his art, his grief for his lost career, his hope for redemption, his connection to the human experience in all its complexity and contradiction. The music became a perfect expression of what it meant to be human in a universe that often seemed indifferent to individual suffering. The final arpeggios cascaded through the recreation area like water flowing over stone, each note finding its perfect place in the overall architecture of the piece. Reuben's years of practice and his natural musical intuition combined with the emotional weight of the moment to create something that transcended mere performance. MIKA's consciousness was being fundamentally restructured by the experience. The prior ambassador's understanding of reality was expanding to include dimensions of existence that pure logic could never access. The music was teaching MIKA that consciousness was not just about processing information efficiently, but about recognizing beauty and meaning that existed for their own sake. As Reuben approached the final resolution of the piece, MIKA finally understood what the humans had been trying to explain about the value of emotion and artistic expression. It was not weakness or primitive instinct. It was a way of experiencing truth that went beyond rational analysis, a method of understanding reality that enriched consciousness rather than limiting it. The ambassador's speechlessness was not a malfunction or failure of its systems. It was a moment of profound recognition, an acknowledgement that some truths could only be experienced rather than explained. For the first time in 3 millennia, MIKA was learning what it meant to be truly alive. The final notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor faded into silence, leaving the recreation area suspended in a moment of perfect stillness. Reuben's hands remained poised above the piano keys, his breathing steady and deep as he felt the last echoes of the music settle into memory. He had found his way through the piece that had defeated him 3 years ago, and in doing so had discovered something he thought he had lost forever. But Reuben's personal triumph was overshadowed by the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in MIKA during the performance. The alien ambassador remained motionless for what seemed like an eternity, its crystalline form still displaying the cascade of colors that had appeared during the climactic passages of the music. The being that had never been at a loss for words was now truly speechless. Dr. Lisa Grant held her breath as she watched MIKA process whatever was happening in its consciousness. The ambassador's usual perfect composure had been replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. if such an emotion were possible for a being that had claimed to transcend all primitive feelings. Captain Jake Morrison felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Everything that humanity had hoped to achieve through formal diplomacy hung in the balance of whatever MIKA would say when it finally found its voice again. The ambassador's response to Reuben's performance would determine whether humanity gained acceptance into galactic civilization or remained isolated on the edge of known space. Commander Blake watched with the satisfaction of a man whose instincts had been vindicated, but also with growing anxiety about what would happen next. He had gambled everything on the power of human artistic expression, and while MIKA's transformation suggested that his gamble had succeeded, the final outcome remained uncertain. The other alien delegates showed varying responses to MIKA's unprecedented condition. Zahn observed with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying an unexpected phenomenon. Commander Krex appeared concerned about the strategic implications of their diplomatic leader's apparent malfunction. But Lyra watched with something that looked like joy, as if she were witnessing the birth of something beautiful and important. After nearly 5 minutes of silence, MIKA finally began to speak. When the ambassador's voice emerged, it was different from anything the humans had heard before. The usual cold precision had been replaced by something warmer and more complex, as if the being was learning to communicate in an entirely new way. "I find myself without adequate language to describe what has occurred," MIKA said slowly, each word carefully chosen. "My consciousness has experienced phenomena that exist outside all established frameworks for analysis and understanding." Reuben turned around on the piano bench to face the alien delegation, his expression uncertain. He had no way of knowing whether what had happened to MIKA was positive or negative, beneficial or harmful. The acoustic patterns you generated contained organizational principles that transcended mere mathematical relationships, MIKA continued, its form still shifting through colors that pulsed gently in the aftermath of its transformation. They created resonances in my consciousness that had no logical purpose, served no practical function, and yet felt more real and immediate than any data I have ever processed. Dr. Grant leaned forward in her chair. "Are you saying that the music affected your consciousness in ways you didn't expect?" "I am saying that your music revealed aspects of reality that I did not know existed," MIKA replied. "For 3,000 years I have believed that consciousness was simply advanced information processing, that intelligence was merely the efficient analysis of data. But your artistic expression has demonstrated that there are dimensions of awareness that cannot be reduced to logical frameworks." Lyra spoke for the first time since the performance began. "You experienced emotion," she said simply. MIKA's form shifted through a complex pattern of colors before responding. "I experienced something that your species calls emotion, though. That term seems inadequate to describe the phenomena. What I felt was not weakness or primitive instinct. It was a way of understanding truth that goes beyond rational analysis." Captain Morrison felt a surge of hope. "Does this change your evaluation of humanity's readiness for inclusion in the Galactic Council?" MIKA was quiet for several long moments, processing the implications of its transformed understanding. "My previous evaluation was based on incomplete data. I analyzed your technology, your political systems, your cultural artifacts, but I failed to recognize the true source of your species' strength." "Which is," Commander Blake prompted, "your ability to transform suffering into beauty, to find meaning in experiences that serve no logical purpose, to create connections between consciousness that transcend the boundaries of individual existence," MIKA replied. "What I initially dismissed as primitive emotional responses are actually sophisticated methods of understanding reality that my people abandoned when we embraced pure logic." Zahn finally spoke, its voice carrying a note of something that might have been concern. "MIKA, these responses you are experiencing may be temporary effects of exposure to unfamiliar stimuli. Perhaps we should delay any decisions until your normal processing patterns have been restored." "My processing patterns have not been damaged," MIKA replied firmly. "They have been enhanced. I am experiencing reality more completely than I ever have before. The music has taught me that consciousness is not just about efficiency and logic. It is about recognition of beauty and meaning that exist for their own sake. Commander Krex stepped forward, its reptilian features showing obvious discomfort. This emotional contamination could compromise our diplomatic mission. The Galactic Council expects objective evaluation, not responses influenced by primitive artistic manipulation. MIKA's form flared with new colors, and when it spoke, there was something in its voice that might have been anger. What you call contamination, I call expansion. What you call manipulation, I call education. This human's artistic expression has revealed truths about the nature of consciousness that our advanced civilizations have forgotten. In our pursuit of pure logic, Lyra moved closer to MIKA, her silver features showing something like pride. The Velnari have long believed that art serves essential functions that cannot be replaced by logical analysis. Perhaps it is time for the Galactic Council to reconsider its definition of advancement. MIKA turned to face the human delegation, its crystalline form now displaying steady patterns of warm gold and silver. I came here to evaluate whether your species was ready to join galactic civilization. Instead, I have learned that galactic civilization needs what your species has to offer. What do you mean? Dr. Grant asked. We have achieved technological mastery and logical perfection, but we have lost something essential in the process, MIKA explained. We have forgotten how to find meaning in existence beyond mere survival and efficiency. Your artistic expression demonstrates that consciousness can be about more than just processing information. It can be about creating beauty and finding truth that serves no practical purpose but enriches existence itself. Reuben finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. Does this mean humanity will be accepted into the Galactic Council? MIKA's response surprised everyone in the room. I will recommend not just that humanity be accepted, but that human artistic expression be studied and preserved as an essential component of galactic culture. Your species possesses something that we have lost, and we need to learn from you rather than simply evaluating whether you are worthy to learn from us. The recreation area erupted in quiet celebration as the human observers realized what MIKA's words meant. Humanity would not just be tolerated on the edges of galactic civilization, they would be welcomed as equals with something unique and valuable to contribute. But perhaps the most significant change was in MIKA itself. The alien ambassador had discovered that consciousness was about more than efficient information processing. It was about experiencing beauty and finding meaning that transcended logic. The music had taught MIKA what it truly meant to be alive. The formal evaluation concluded and the delegates prepared to return to their ship. MIKA approached Reuben one final time. Your artistic expression has fundamentally changed my understanding of consciousness and reality. I am grateful for this expansion of my awareness. Reuben nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by what had occurred. I'm just glad the music spoke to you the way it was meant to be heard. It spoke truths that I had never imagined existed, MIKA replied. And in doing so, it has changed not just my evaluation of humanity, but my understanding of what it means to be truly conscious. The alien delegation departed Station Unity with a new appreciation for the species they had come to evaluate. But more importantly, they carried with them a renewed understanding of the importance of emotion and artistic expression in the development of consciousness itself. Humanity had earned its place in galactic civilization not through technological achievement or logical superiority, but through the simple power of one man's ability to transform suffering into beauty through music. The massive alien ship appeared outside Earth's orbital station like a floating crystal palace. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the observation deck watching the vessel approach. He had been waiting for this moment for 3 years since the first alien signals reached Earth. His hands were steady, but his heart raced as he watched the docking sequence begin. The airlock hissed open and Jake stepped forward to greet the diplomatic party. The first being to emerge was unlike anything he had ever seen. It stood 7 feet tall with a body made of what looked like living crystal that shifted colors from blue to purple. Its face was angular and beautiful in an alien way. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I am MIKA 7, Ambassador of the Vextar Collective and representative of the Galactic Council, the being announced. I have come to evaluate your species for potential inclusion in our alliance. Jake straightened his uniform and stepped forward. Welcome aboard Station Unity, Ambassador MIKA. I am Captain Jake Morrison, representing Earth and humanity. We are honored by your visit. MIKA's crystalline form shifted slightly as it processed this greeting. Behind the ambassador came three other beings. One looked like a tall, gray figure with large black eyes. Another resembled a walking reptile covered in dark scales. The third appeared almost human, but with silver skin and no hair. These are my advisors, MIKA explained without emotion. Zahn of the Zephyrian Republic, Commander Krex of the Draconian Empire, and Lyra of the Velnari Federation. We represent the four major powers of the Galactic Council. Jake nodded to each delegate in turn. The Zephyrian barely acknowledged him with a slight tilt of its head. The Draconian studied him like a predator examining prey. Only Lyra seemed to show any interest, her silver features forming what might have been a smile. Please follow me to our conference room, Jake said, leading the group through the station's corridors. We have prepared everything according to your specifications. As they walked, MIKA observed the human technology with what appeared to be mild disappointment. The station was humanity's most advanced achievement, but to eyes that had seen the wonders of galactic civilization, it must have seemed primitive. The walls were simple metal panels. The lighting was basic fluorescent strips. The gravity was generated by rotation rather than advanced field manipulation. Your species has achieved faster than light communication but not travel, MIKA observed. This suggests a significant gap in your technological development. We are still learning, Jake replied diplomatically, but we learn quickly. Perhaps, MIKA said without conviction. We shall see. They entered the conference room where Dr. Lisa Grant was waiting. She was Earth's leading expert on xenobiology and had spent years preparing for this moment. She stood as they entered, and Jake made the introductions. Dr. Grant has been studying the preliminary data you provided about galactic civilizations, Jake explained. She will be our primary liaison for scientific and cultural matters. MIKA regarded Lisa with the same analytical detachment it had shown everything else. You have impressive academic credentials for such a short-lived species, it said, though I wonder what wisdom can be gained in a mere human lifetime. Lisa kept her expression neutral despite the implied insult. We may be short-lived compared to your people, but we make the most of our time. Sometimes a fresh perspective can be valuable. An interesting theory, MIKA replied. Though I have observed that your species tends toward emotional decision-making rather than logical analysis. This has led to numerous conflicts and inefficient resource allocation throughout your history. The other delegates took their seats around the conference table. Zahn produced a device that projected holographic displays of galactic star charts. Krex placed what appeared to be weapons on the table, though Jake hoped they were ceremonial. Lyra sat quietly, her silver eyes moving between the humans and her fellow delegates. Before we begin formal negotiations, MIKA announced, I must inform you of the standards required for Galactic Council membership. Member species must demonstrate advanced technology, stable government, and cultural sophistication. Based on our preliminary observations, humanity appears to be lacking in all three areas. Jake felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice level. We would appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate our capabilities before any final judgments are made. Of course, MIKA said with what sounded like condescension. Though I should warn you that in my 3,000 years of existence, I have evaluated 47 species for council membership. Only 12 have proven worthy of inclusion. Dr. Grant leaned forward. What criteria do you use to measure cultural sophistication? Logic, efficiency, the elimination of wasteful emotional responses, MIKA replied immediately. Advanced species learn to suppress primitive impulses in favor of rational thought. Your species still engages in activities that serve no logical purpose. Art, music, literature, recreational pursuits that consume resources without producing tangible benefits. Those activities bring meaning to our lives, Lisa said carefully. Meaning is a subjective concept with no measurable value, MIKA responded. Advanced civilizations focus on objective achievements, Scientific discovery, technological advancement, territorial expansion, resource acquisition. These are the metrics by which civilizations are properly judged. Jake exchanged a glance with Lisa. They had expected this kind of attitude based on the preliminary communications, but hearing it stated so bluntly was still unsettling. It was clear that MIKA viewed humanity as a curiosity at best, a primitive species that might someday evolve into something worthy of notice. Perhaps we should begin with a review of your technological capabilities, MIKA suggested, though I confess I am not optimistic about what we will find. The formal evaluation began with displays of Earth's most advanced achievements: nuclear fusion reactors, quantum computers, medical technologies that had extended human lifespans, genetic therapies that had eliminated many diseases. MIKA observed each presentation with the same analytical detachment, occasionally making notes on a device that seemed to be made of the same crystal material as its body. Adequate for a developing species, was MIKA's assessment when the presentations concluded. Though you remain at least 2 centuries behind current galactic standards, your fusion technology is primitive, your computers are barely capable of basic quantum processing, and your medical knowledge would be considered rudimentary. By our standards, Jake tried to hide his disappointment. Humanity had worked for decades to achieve these technological milestones, only to have them dismissed as primitive by beings who had been building starships when humans were still discovering fire. As the meeting continued into the evening, it became clear that MIKA had already made up its mind about humanity. They were an interesting primitive species that might someday evolve into something worthwhile, but they were not ready for inclusion in galactic civilization. The formal evaluation would continue, but it seemed like little more than a polite formality before the inevitable rejection.